diverged from strategic doctrine as commonly practiced, of when to break the rules in ways unimagined by lesser leaders, those animated by the rules. Napoleon, perhaps the embodiment of everything we imagine when we envision coup d'oeil, observed, quote, "The art of war consists with an inferior army of always having more forces than your enemy at the point where you attack, or at the point which is attacked. But this art cannot be learned either from books or from practice. It's a feeling of command which properly constitutes the genius for war." Let's look at our example from the Civil War, the Battle of Chancellorsville. The time was May of 1863. The South was in the ascendance following a string of victories in the Eastern Theater by the Army of Northern Virginia over the Union Army of the Potomac. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is considered by some historians to be the greatest fighting force of the 19th century. Cohesive, well-trained, well-led, loyal, and motivated by chivalric values. This Confederate States Army was confronted by a Northern Army twice its size near Chancellorsville. This is in Virginia, under the command of Union Major General Joseph Hooker. Again, we are presented with the conundrum of objective factors versus strategy versus high concept, strategic insight. Think of it. Lee versus Hooker. Both of them schooled at West Point Military Academy. Both served in the Mexican-American War of the late 1840s, and they fought together at the Battle of Chapultepec in the Mexican-American War in 1847. The Virginia terrain was familiar to both men. They both learned at the figurative feet of the Swiss-born French strategist Antoine Jomini, whose principles were taught in West Point classrooms. Hooker, he commanded the superior force. He was entrenched on superb terrain, better supplied, greater numerically by 2 to 1, 133,000 Union soldiers versus only 60,000 Southern troops. Now, in this situation, surely the superior force would easily defeat the inferior opponent using Jominian principles of planning and maneuver. And yet, in the most lopsided contest of the entire Civil War, Lee won. It's been called his perfect battle. Lee violated one of the most bedrock pieces of conventional wisdom: never divide your army in the face of a superior foe. Yet this is exactly what Lee did. Hooker played by the book, and Lee broke the rules. It was the human qualities of intuitive audacity versus analytic timidity. What happened? Hooker had concentrated his army in a formidable position, which he had carefully and skillfully fortified. Lee went into bivouac to confer with his top lieutenant general, Stonewall Jackson. During the night, Lee's engineers reconnoitered the Federal front, and they pronounced a direct attack impracticable. Something in the lay of the land, the descriptions of his engineers, something in his experience told Lee what to do. And it was then that Lee said to Jackson, "We must attack from our left," and Jackson was prepared. According to Lee's own account, he, quote, stated to General Jackson, "We must attack on our left as soon as practicable," and the necessary movement of the troops began immediately. While Jackson moved surreptitiously in a forced march around the Union flank, Lee confronted and attempted to hold in place the great mass of Hooker's army with just 2 divisions of troops, just 13,000 men against 70,000 men. The dense forest on the front prevented Hooker from detecting the small Confederate numbers. For their part, on the other side, the Confederates made fierce feint attacks with infantry and artillery against Hooker's front. They kept up almost continuous fire. And this deceived Hooker, made him hesitate to advance from his entrenchments to find out the actual situation. And this way, Lee held him all day in check, while Jackson swiftly marched around the Union right flank. Jackson attacked at 5 p.m. after a forced march, and he caught the Federals completely by surprise. They were cooking their dinner when Jackson's troops charged the Union camp and swept everything before them. It was only the approaching darkness that halted the Confederate attack and prevented a complete rout of the entire Army of the Potomac. The decision to split his army in the face of 2 to 1 odds may have seemed like madness to junior officers or even veterans. It was something that Hooker did not expect. It was a decision born of necessity. It was no strategic checklist that led Lee to make his decision. It was strategic insight. Lee's intuition, his knowledge of the terrain, his knowledge of Hooker's timidity, his faith in the indomitable Stonewall Jackson, in his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, all of this came together in the mind of Lee in some unknown calculus. The result was a decision to go against what he and Hooker had learned in school at West Point from Jean Monnet. 70 years later, another general from another country recognized what Lee accomplished at Chancellorsville and what it meant for generals in all places and in all times. German General Waldemar Erfurth penned a classic on warfare called Surprise. In it, he urged a balance between the mundane checklist view of strategy and an over-reliance upon instinct. But above all, he urged the daring necessary to strike when an opponent has left himself vulnerable. Quote, "The military leader must indeed be able to rid himself from traditional precepts, yet in doing so, he should never forget that heterodoxy has its limits beyond which it is no longer effective, but becomes dangerous. Above all, the soldier must learn to recognize the mistakes of the enemy and to exploit them, though this may sometimes require departure from accepted military rules." In our own time, folks who study intuition recognize that there is much more to strategic intuition than magic, or a hunch, or instinct. Gary Klein has become one of this country's foremost experts on intuitive decision-making. Gary studies firefighters to see how they make their fast decisions under extreme time pressure and stress. Now, he already knew that in the literal heat of a fire, an experienced firefighter, he doesn't make decisions according to the standard analytical model, comparing the many ways to, say, put out a fire. No, Gary thought that they'd come up with maybe two options and then act. But he was wrong. Most firefighters, especially ones with more experience, usually just considered a single option. They would just act. The most common statement he heard from firefighters was, quote, "We don't make decisions." Now, these firefighters would simply respond to the situation. Gary was amazed. Quote, "I had stumbled onto the phenomenon of intuition, although I didn't realize it at the time, although I wasn't looking for intuition. Intuition had found me." It turns out that these firefighters and nurses and doctors and military officers, early responders of all types, share a common skill: intuitive decision-making. In business, the idea of intuition and decision-making it's not all that readily accepted. It still carries the whiff of magical incantation. But in the military, for instance, the United States Marine Corps, intuitive decision-making is part of the training process. The term intuitive decision-making appears in their manual on command and control, and it's compared favorably with analytical decision-making. In this case, Gary Klein views intuition as the gradual amalgamation of large repertoires of patterns that are acquired over many years of practice, actions and responses that train the mind to understand a multitude of experiences and then quickly yield the correct answer in similar situations in the future. Without these patterns, without this experience base, decision makers would be paralyzed. Formal analyses can be valuable to supplement intuition, but they cannot substitute for intuition when it comes to business decisions or career decisions or political decisions. Gary Klein has successfully moved our perception of intuition to a reasonable recognition of its value. Two extreme views predominated: the realm of the magical, where intuition was inexplicable, and the realm of the skeptical, where intuition was ridiculed. He suggests that we combine the approaches of intuition and analysis. Let's build on the strengths of each, recognizing their weaknesses as well. A good synthesis of the two that seems most effective is when we allow intuition to lead the way so that it directs our analysis. And in this way, intuition helps us recognize situations and helps us decide our actions. Analysis then verifies our intuitions to make sure they aren't misleading us. In this way, we can come up with a method of cultivating our own intuition and of relying upon it, learning to trust it under the right circumstances. Here is a 7-step general guide to help you begin developing and utilizing your intuitive insights as you tackle problems. 1. Recognize that the first option you think of is probably the best. This is not always true, but it tends to be correct, and it is substantiated by research. So recognize your first impulse before you erode it with too much analysis. Record it. Hold it for consideration. Analyze it as part of your decision-making process. Evaluate your first impulse in the context of your experience by imagining how your decision would be carried out and what could go wrong. Do your own personal scenario planning. 2. Ensure that you understand what's going on here. You can deliberate all day, but if you don't understand what is going on, your choice of action will likely be wrong. 3. Override your intuitions when they mislead you. It's dangerous to use intuition without reflection because it can lead to fixation. We may think we understand a situation even if we don't, and then we make matters worse by catering to our bias and explaining away all contrary evidence. To break free of inaccurate beliefs, ask yourself if there is any evidence that would make you change your mind. If not, then you've built a cocoon around your beliefs. 4. Think ahead. Intuition can help us think ahead of the curve by creating expectations, by connecting the dots, by flagging inconsistencies, or by warning us of problems. The world is too complex to think ahead using careful analysis of situations. We have to rely on intuition instead. But to rely on it, we have to give intuition a chance. 5. Uncertainty is a natural component of intuitive decision-making. Too many people become frustrated, even fearful with uncertainty. Uncertainty can paralyze them or send them chasing for information that will arrive too late and still won't be enough to answer all the questions. You never have perfect information to make a certain decision until you've been overcome by events. The key is knowing when there's enough information to act and then having the courage to act. Here it's helpful to remember Clausewitz's recipe for military genius. Quote, an intellect that, even in the darkest hour, retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth. And second, the courage to follow this faint light wherever it may lead. 6. Use the right decision-making strategy. You can rely on intuition, sure, but at times it's best to evaluate all of the factors that impinge on your decision. If the issues are complicated and no one has good intuitions about the overall situation, analysis makes more sense than relying on gut feelings. 7. Watch out for the naysayers. Here are the signs of those naysayers. Management doesn't value the experience of key employees. Superiors expect employees to follow directions without being given the chance to have them clarified. Management is intolerant of uncertainty and relies on massive amounts of data collection as a cure for uncertainty. Systems encourage everyone to manage by using simple numerical goals to make things clear. Management starts looking for ways to substitute computer systems for human expertise. Now, there is, of course, a lot more than these 7 tips, but they're a start, and they can get you on your way to becoming a more intuitive thinker, a more effective strategic thinker. Through all of this, let's remember the good news. Brilliant insights are not necessarily the stuff of genius, and creativity is no longer a mysterious force. The ability to assemble and reassemble data in new and innovative ways is not limited to the Napoleons or the Steve Jobs of the world. It's accessible to you and to me, and it can be developed. With the right approach and right techniques, creative insight can be cultivated.